Hello everyone. I have a desk full of little stories for you tonight. We're going to take a look at some of the props that keep coming back in my videos. This was often requested. All these objects have a little story to tell. From this little oil lamp to Russian dolls or old books. And this is what makes them unique. What they're made of, where they come from, which tradition or page of history they represent. This is what we're going to explore in this story. Some I have had for a long time, others not so much, and nothing of this is particularly pricey, except for the books maybe, and the painting I will show you later. But I like them all, and they will take us to many different periods and corners of the world. So, before we begin our presentation, please sit or lay down comfortably. As always, you can download this video or the audio from my Patreon page. I now have more than 200 patrons, and I'm grateful for their support. They help keep this channel free of video ads, which benefits everyone, and they paid for some of the equipment and props I use in videos. So I take this opportunity to thank them again. Your generosity and support are truly appreciated. And there's a new thing too. You can now also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms. You will find links in the description. So let's get started. We have plenty of items to review. And first, let's take a look at this little oil lamp, which you have probably seen many times if you're familiar with my channel. I bought it in an antique shop in Iran, in Isfahan, more than 20 years ago. It is made of bronze, and it has a little pouring hole here that's served to put fuel in the lamp, with a little gap looking like a ram head. I don't know how old it is. It may not necessarily be very old, because oil lamps were produced until the early 20th century, until electricity replaced old ways of making artificial light. Its shape resembles the oldest known oil lamps from the antiquity and before. The use of oil lamps is extremely ancient, thousands of years. The oldest ever found was carved in stone and discovered at the cave of Lascaux, which was in use 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Oil lamps were also made of clay or shells converted to lamps. All they needed was a handle, a pouring hole to fill them, and a nozzle. The oil burns and produces a little flame that comes out the nozzle. There was a variety of sources of fuel for oil lamps in ancient times. It could be oil from plants, nuts like almonds or seeds, or it could be animal fat, butter, fish oil, and whale oil too. The use of whale fat was one of the reasons for the whale hunting industry during centuries. So to use this lamp, we would just need a little wick connecting the nozzle to the oil tank and any kind of oil that can feed the flame. I'm sure you know the story of Aladdin and the magic lamp, in which a powerful genie appeared when the lamp was rubbed, and he fulfilled wishes for the lamp's owner. In early pre-Islamic mythology, genies or jinns were supernatural creatures, spirits or demons, and later they were integrated into Islamic mythology and traditions. So they appear in folklore, and they can be either evil creatures bringing misfortune or possession, or they can be more benevolent. Like human beings, they can choose between good and evil. So lamps such as this one, with candles, were the main sources of lighting until the 18th century. At this point, the basic oil lamp that had been in use for thousands of years evolved. New lamps appeared at the end of the 18th century, with a cylindrical chimney which steadied the flame and improved the flow of air. These new models needed much less trimming of the wick, and they produced a lot of light, equivalent to 6 to 10 candles. So this design quickly replaced older models, and in the 19th century, the type of fuel changed too. It was replaced with petroleum, kerosene specifically. This gave the kerosene lamps that we associate with the 19th century. They were mass-produced, and even though they were replaced with electrical devices in the 20th century, they are still in use in many parts of the world, like in Asia and Africa, in rural areas where electricity is unavailable or too expensive. Now let's take a look at an item from Russia. These Russian dolls, also known as Matryoshka dolls. Matryoshka means little matron. I bought this set in Moscow, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. It's not really ancient, but the tradition of making these dolls in Russia is more than 100 years old. They were created by a toy maker and woodcarver at the end of the 19th century. In the first set, which comprised 8 dolls, the larger one was a mother, and there were 7 more inside, her boys and girls. The last one was a baby. Traditionally, the outer layer is a woman dressed in a sarafan. This is the traditional jumper dress that Russian peasants wore. And inside there are multiple smaller dolls. The most traditional material to make them is linden wood. At the start they were known only in Russia, but they were presented at the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris, the World's Fair, where they were noticed and even won an award. Shortly after, they started to be exported internationally, and they have become a symbol of Russia worldwide. Let's go further east with our next object. This is Chinese porcelain, and the blue color is reminiscent of the most praised and expensive period of porcelain production in China, the Ming Dynasty. Chinese ceramics are one of the oldest crafting traditions in the world, and porcelain was invented in China. Actually, it is also called China in English. Of course, pottery and ceramics were widespread in many civilizations, including without contacts between them. But the Chinese discovered a recipe that could produce a very white, slightly translucent and thin ceramic. Their main secret ingredient was kaolin, which is a clay mineral. This porcelain was heated at high temperature, hundreds of degrees, and artfully painted. It was a luxury item in China, worthy of emperors and their courts. Along the centuries, taste changed, and a long tradition evolved. There are distinctive styles depending on the periods and the dynasties. The earliest porcelain items appeared 2000 years ago, maybe even slightly more. They were not totally unknown outside China, but their popularity in Europe exploded in the 17th century, when European traders began to bring back more and more pieces. There was nothing comparable in Europe at the time. There was a long tradition of earthenware items, but they looked almost basic and very rough in comparison. At the time, China was unified. It wasn't always the case during its many centuries of history, and the ruling dynasty were the Mings. The Mings instituted a policy of closing the country on itself. They showed very little curiosity for the rest of the world beyond their immediate neighbors. China was so big and relatively advanced in the 15th century that it seemed no other country could ever threaten it. And along the 15th, 16th and 17th century, this policy of closing the country and keeping it very self-centered only amplified. If the Chinese had been more outward-looking when Europeans started to venture around the world, maybe history could have been very different. But as a matter of fact, the Europeans are the ones who established contact by the seas, reaching Chinese ports, and they created trade routes that competed with the old terrestrial Silk Road. Among other products, like tea and precious silk, they brought back Chinaware, and it looked so perfect, so attractive, that European producers started to try to compete with it, to imitate it. They were also very inspired by this blue color on porcelain pieces. So manufacturers in the 17th century created pieces directly inspired by this Chinese example. There were manufacturers trying to copy Chinese porcelain in various countries, but among them some of the most successful were the ceramic makers in Delft, in the Netherlands. They produced white and blue pieces that were still expensive, upscale items, but they were more affordable than these very pricey Chinese wares. But this was still not porcelain. The code was cracked only in the 18th century. The secret of adding kaolin to the recipe was discovered, and the true European porcelain industry began. For prestige, kings ordered the creation of national manufactures. Among the most successful ones were the manufacturers of Saxony in Germany and the manufacturer of Sèvres in France. At this point, these European porcelain pieces replaced a large part of the Chinese production, but collectors and later museums kept chasing older Chinese pieces. Now, paradoxically, China was very self-centered under the Ming dynasty in the 14th to the 17th centuries. But when it comes to porcelain, it took a lot of inspiration from foreign forms and aesthetics, especially inspired by Islamic metalwork. This distinctive blue was obtained with cobalt, but Chinese porcelain is also extremely diverse. All colors were used: green, yellow, red. These objects were really at the meeting point of technique and art. Our next item will be this book. It says Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours, Around the World in 80 Days. The novel by Jules Verne. My grandmother gave me this book when I was 10 or 12 maybe. It is the first edition of Jules Verne's novel in this collection. This was printed in the 1870s. Jules Verne was a publishing phenomenon in the 19th century. His novels were very popular, And he was also very productive, very prolific. He wrote dozens of novels, so he made the fortune of his publisher. At the time, in Western Europe and in America, popular authors published some of their novels in newspapers. The readers had a few pages every day, and this benefited the news publishers. You didn't want to miss what was coming next, and also the authors, because they got access to a large audience. Only after this pre-publishing in daily papers, these high-profile novels were published in books, and they sold very well, including this kind of high-end edition. But out of this abundant production of novels and books in the 19th century, only a few ones became classics. This book is just part of a series of probably 10 to 20 different volumes. There were more than 50 novels in this collection, the Extraordinary Journeys, Les Voyages Extraordinaires. The cover is ornamented with a bit of gold leaf, and so is the side. And inside there is an abundance of pictures, engravings, and even maps. But what I like the most about this book is that it was read multiple times. I remember I read it when I was a kid, but it had been read by several generations before, from my great-grandparents. The wear proves it. These pages have been turned a lot of times, and they have captivated a lot of people along decades. Let's stay in France for the next item. This is my little Eiffel Tower. I don't know where it comes from, honestly. I've had it for as long as I can remember. I used to see it, the real one, every day when I lived in Paris, when I got out of my home. Now that I live in Chile, I am not feeling homesick, but I'm always happy to see it. You know that the tower was supposed to be temporary. It was built in 1889 as the entrance to a World's Fair. Not the 1900 World's Fair I told you about earlier. This was 11 years earlier. The tower was supposed to be dismantled after the event. Everybody agreed that it was impressive. At the time it was the highest man-made structure in the world. But many people also found it ugly and vulgar, because it didn't combine well with the sense of unity in the architecture of Paris. It is true that many parts of Paris have not changed much visually since 1889. At the time, the city had recently been redesigned, and it had taken the appearance we know today, a city of the 19th century, with a lot of carved stone, a lot of ornaments, in which earlier buildings from the 17th and 18th centuries blended easily. the height of buildings, the number of floors, even the number of windows were regulated to preserve this general aesthetic, and so were the colors, the stone ornaments, everything. In the middle of this, the tower looked too tall, too metallic, too modern. But after the World's Fair, it was not immediately dismantled, and people started to grow fond of it. This was also a time when Paris was becoming a bigger and bigger tourist destination, and the tower attracted people. In a few years, it became a symbol of Paris, and it also became useful a few years later for communication as an antenna. So finally, it was never dismantled. The tower is made of wrought iron, which is an iron alloy with very few carbon in it. Nowadays, this type of large tower would probably be built in steel, but at the time, steel had not replaced iron in architecture yet. Another innovation that amazed people when the tower was open to the public were the large lifts to rise to the upper levels of the tower. Lifts were already a known technology in 1889, but these ones were huge by the standards of the time. Cars weighed 10 tons and could each hold 65 passengers. The tower became a cultural icon in the 20th century. Now it's like the pyramids of Egypt or the Statue of Liberty. It is recognized everywhere. Next, from the same period, I have this Orientalist painting, which I bought about 15 years ago at an auction, at a time when I was a lot into the history of the Middle East, and I collected Oriental arms. So, this is a watercolor by a painter called Paul Pascal. You probably don't know him, and that's normal, because he was a minor painter who specialized in landscapes. He produced dozens of such watercolors from North Africa and Egypt, and later he emigrated to America in the 1890s, and there he made paintings of American wilderness and Native Americans. There is his signature here at the bottom. He was moderately successful, very moderately actually. He died in poverty. But even though there may not be anything extraordinary in this painting, I liked the calm, the peace in this landscape, and the invitation to dream. Orientalist painting is completely out of favor, out of fashion nowadays. Orientalism is the name given to a popular theme in painting. in the 18th and 19th centuries. The depiction of the Middle East and North Africa. So it is just a topic, not a style or a particular approach to painting. At the time, Orientalism was fashionable in Europe. People were drawn to these exotic, dreamy worlds that were no longer hostile or terrifying like in the previous centuries, because the Europeans were now colonizing them, or they were seen as decadent. But this had its appeal. They were colorful, pre-industrial, they had kept something genuine, and yet they were accessible because travelers from Europe could go there quite easily. There is a particular gaze to Orientalism. Painters were only interested in what was exotic, ancient, and typical. They were looking for stereotypes, actually, and they banned many aspects of their depiction of these regions when they looked too modern or didn't fit the stereotypes. Orientalism is a fabrication, in a sense. It says as much about the West and the people who painted as it does about the Middle East at the time. But still I like the sense of wonder in these paintings. Maybe you can relate to this sense of nostalgia for this time when the world was more mysterious than today, and images from far away were more precious, more rare than they have become. And this is all I like in this watercolor. The colors are almost appetizing. The scene is dreamy with the Nile. You can almost feel the warmth. There is a sense of perfection and eternity in this view. Next, we have another framed object. This is a silver necklace, typical of the jewelry made by the Mapuche people in Chile. I got it the first time I traveled to Chile before moving here. So, who are the Mapuches? They are the native people that occupied the center and south of Chile, and regions of Argentina too, before the arrival of the Spanish. Their territory began where ended the Inca Empire. They had contacts with the Incas, but they were far away in the south, and they fiercely defended their independence from them. When the Spanish started to create cities in what would become Chile, like Valdivia and Santiago, and they started to develop the colony, they coexisted with the Mapuches. Sometimes there were conflicts and skirmishes, but they also traded with them. The Spanish paid in silver coins. The Mapuches knew metallurgy and silver, but they had never had such a quantity of silver available. silver was very abundant in South America in the 17th and 18th centuries. A bit further north, in what is Bolivia today, there were the mines of Potosi, from which the Spanish extracted a huge quantity of silver. Still today, a big part of the silver in circulation around the world was extracted during this period in Bolivia and Peru. Potosi was the largest silver mine in the world. With this silver, Mapuche silversmiths started to develop a specific tradition of jewelry making. Sometimes silver coins were used as such, as pendants, but they also developed an aesthetic that looked like nothing else, with articulations between the pieces of silver and sometimes large pectoral covers and caps that displayed the wealth of their owners. Until the middle of the 19th century, the coexistence between the Spanish and the emigrants to the colony and the Mapuches was not too violent. In theory, their land was part of the Spanish viceroyalty, the colony of Peru, which covered modern Chile and Argentina. But in fact, the Mapuches had not been conquered. They ruled on their land without interference. This changed in the second half of the 19th century. Chile and Argentina became independent from Spain. In the first decades of independence in Latin America, frontiers changed a lot, and there were several wars between the new countries. The old Spanish viceroyalties exploded into several countries. For example, in the north of South America, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador appeared from the viceroyalty of New Granada. In the middle, the viceroyalty of Peru broke into Peru and Chile, and the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata that had been created by the end of the Spanish Empire as a division of the viceroyalty of Peru, because it had become huge, gave Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Paraguay. But the frontiers between these brand new countries were moving and conflictual. So there were wars in the 19th century. And Chile was not the last to participate in this game. The northern third of the country, as it is today, was taken from Bolivia and Peru in a war that made Bolivia lose its access to the Pacific Ocean. The relations between the two countries remain tense to this day, mainly for this reason, even though that was 130 years ago. But Chile also wished to expand to the south and actually colonize these regions on which it had a claim, but that were in fact independent, the regions owned and populated by the Mapuches. There was a war in 1869 that decimated the independent Mapuches. It was followed by a smallpox epidemic that worsened it, and the state of Chile took control of that land and tried to attract as many colonists as possible to populate it. This was the time when there was a quite big German emigration to the south of Chile. The Mapuches were basically stripped of their land to make room for colonization. And this story repeated all across America in the 19th century. It was maybe even worse for the Mapuches in Argentina, where they were exterminated and few remain today. So this Mapuche silverwork had produced a lot of pieces in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but it almost disappeared, and there was a revival in the past decades, quite recently. Nowadays the Mapuches represent about 10% of the Chilean population. They all speak Spanish, but their language, Mapudungun, has not disappeared. Actually, there are many words from it in Chilean Spanish. For example, everywhere in Spanish-speaking countries, a baby is called un bebé. In Chile, people say una guagua, which is a word coming from Mapudungun. There are also many places around Chile with indigenous names. And nowadays Mapuches in Chile are concentrated in their historical region, in the center of Chile, a region called Araucanía. And many also emigrated to Santiago for the jobs. While we are in Latin America, let's stay in the region with our next object. This is a traditional calabash, a calabash gourd for mate from Argentina. It's a bit dusty. So, what is mate? It is hard to find around the world, except in Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay, where it is a national beverage. And you see many people, old and young, going around with their mug of mate and a straw to drink it. Mate comes from a plant, yerba mate, which is native to Paraguay. Mate leaves are dried, chopped, and ground into almost a powder, like tea leaves are, and they are mixed with hot water directly into this little bowl. It is not brewed in a teapot before serving. So, to drink it, people use these straws. There are holes at the bottom to keep out the leaves. Mate is rich in caffeine. Basically, it is an equivalent to tea or coffee. But the taste is quite different. It is stronger than most teas, earthy and rather bitter too, a bit like a dark, rich coffee would be. Personally, I don't mind the bitterness, but the earthy taste is not my favorite thing. Anyway, I encourage you to try once, if you get a chance. Traditionally, the container is made of a calabash, which is a fruit that grows from a vine. When it is harvested young, it can be consumed as a vegetable, but when they are more mature, calabashes can be dried and used as a bowl or a container. If you want to be fancy, the metal ornaments and the straw are supposed to be made of silver, but mine are cheaper than that. This is metallic, but it must be brass, I guess. The consumption of mate is very ancient. It seems it originated among the Guarani people from Paraguay in the pre-Columbian era, and it was first recorded by Spanish colonizers in the 15th century. Now let's completely change setting with this little statue. You probably find it familiar. This is a reproduction of one of the most famous masterpieces of sculpture from the Renaissance. This is the Pietà. Pietà means pity, and the sculpture is housed at St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. It depicts the dead body of Jesus on the lap of his mother, Mary, just after the crucifixion. This theme of the Pietà is recurrent in Christian art. It appeared during the Middle Ages, and it was reproduced for centuries in paintings and sculptures to decorate churches, chapels, or even tombs. Depending on the periods and the artists, the interpretation could vary from a scene of intense pain and despair to a more calm, serene, and soft scene. Michelangelo's work, because this is Michelangelo's Pietà, was very different from any previous depiction of this theme. In style, it is very realistic, apparently. The detail of the draperies, the bodies, and the faces are very carefully carved. When it came to sculpture, the ideals of the Renaissance were all about balance and classical beauty, which is what we have here. The realism is reminiscent of Greek classical sculpture, and this is carefully constructed. The whole statue forms like a pyramid with the head of Mary at the top. And yet, this is not realistic at all. Jesus looks comparatively very small. He almost disappears into the draperies of her clothes. And Mary is very young. Many Pietas before this one depicted her as a 50-year-old woman, which was logical, whereas he represented her as a young woman, in her 20s maybe. This turns the statue into almost a concept, the capture of a moment of softness and restrained sadness that makes it very emotional. This was sculpted in 1498-1499, before the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. The basilica was started in 1506, and the construction lasted for more than a century. It was moved inside the basilica later, where it can now be seen in real size by visitors. Now let's go back east with our next items. These are chopsticks that I bought near Beijing. They are quite fancy. They have cloisonné ornaments, and so does this tea box here. This is not painted. The surface of the box is covered in enamel of various colors, separated by thin strips of metal. Cloisonné means compartmented in French. The makers of these objects create plenty of these compartments, and then the compartments are filled with a colorful material, heated, and the final product is very resistant. Even centuries after, objects decorated with this technique look as new. This is a very ancient technique. The Egyptians used it. For example, these pectoral jewels that the pharaohs wore. They were created this way. The fillers for the compartments could be gemstones or a type of glass paste that the Egyptians made. In antiquity, cloisonné was mainly used on small jewelry pieces and small objects. The use of enamel developed in Byzantium to produce larger objects and even pictures, icons. The know-how traveled eastward, and it reached China in the 14th century via the Islamic world. And the Chinese took it to another level thanks to their knowledge of enamel. We talked about porcelain before. Cloisonné works were not as big as a discovery for Europeans, but Chinese objects decorated like this were also brought back to Europe, where the technique had become not forgotten but marginalized. And this is how cloisonné returned to the West. The time and know-how invested in these objects is quite impressive. It's very meticulous. The artisan has to create all the small sections with very thin wire. These sections define the colored areas. Enamel comes under the form of a powder, which contains metallic oxides for coloring. The powder is turned into a sort of paint that is applied inside each compartment, and when the object is dry, it is fired in a special oven. The enamel in each compartment sinks down after firing because the heat makes it shrink. So the process has to be repeated multiple times until the compartments are all filled to the top of the metallic edge. Then the object is polished and it's finally ready. Now from Mexico we have this Aztec calendar on a piece of obsidian. This is contemporary, but in Mesoamerica, like in other ancient civilizations, people used a lot of obsidian for tools and occasionally jewelry. To make blades, obsidian is better than flintstones because it fractures with very sharp edges, and it's a very hard material. It was never extremely precious because it was not that rare, but it's not that easy to find neither. Obsidian is a type of glass that forms when lava rich in silicate cools rapidly. It is a type of volcanic glass which is deep black or greenish black. There is archaeological evidence that the use of obsidian by prehistoric men started several tens of thousands of years ago, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years. Obsidian was perfect for cutting or piercing. It could be used for knives or arrowheads, and also it could be polished and transformed into everyday objects. Now, obsidian was quite abundant in Central America, which is why the Maya, the Olmecs, the Aztecs, all peoples from Mesoamerica developed craftsmanship using this material. In many areas it was accessible even to the poor. A lot of items were found, like blades of course, but also plates or bowls that had been patiently polished from bigger blocks, and plenty of non-utilitarian artifacts, little figurines of humans or animals, beads, vases, pieces of masks too. It seems obsidian was used in bloodletting activities. People would cut themselves and offer a bit of their blood to their gods as a kind of auto-sacrifice. Some researchers believe that Mesoamericans saw obsidian as a type of blood that originated from the earth. So using it in sacrifice was symbolic, spiritual to them. The most valuable and prestigious obsidian in Mesoamerica was green obsidian from Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan was a city located 25 miles away from Mexico City. In the first centuries of our era, it was very wealthy and successful, reaching a size of more than 100,000 inhabitants. Like pretty much all city-states in Mesoamerica, it shined for a long time, and then it declined and it was finally abandoned. But in the meantime, it had been very influential. It disseminated a lot of artifacts sold or offered to other states, including to the Maya city-states in the south, where green obsidian from Teotihuacan was highly valued. And now our last item. This is from Myanmar, Burma. Myanmar is the modern name of Burma. And it is, or it was, a portable pantry for Buddhist monks. It is a pile of 4 containers that can be piled up and transported easily with the handle. It is made of wood, covered in lacquer. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. Buddhist monks cannot work. They live with very little belongings, basically what they wear and what they can carry with them. And all their food is offerings from people. But contrary to the Western monastic tradition, the state of monk is not something you choose forever. Some people can, but it is frequent for people to become monks for a time and then return to secular life. It is an experience that may or may not last more than a few years. Now, monks in Christian monasteries are not prisoners either, but the decision they make when they access that status is supposed to be for the remainder of their lives. There is a different tradition in Buddhism, at least in Myanmar. So that kind of pantry is handy to collect offerings in food, rice mainly, and they can carry it with them. This one has served, you can tell by the usage. The quality of the lacquer was probably not great, but it has lost pieces and it is damaged here and there. The term lacquer nowadays is used for a lot of different wood finishes or even for paint. But these are generally synthetic materials. Long before they appeared, a long tradition of lacquerware developed in Asia. They made objects, such as this one, coated with the sap of a tree, the Chinese lacquer tree. The sap was treated and sometimes dyed, and then applied like paint on objects, usually wood objects because it sticks to wood. Once dried, and after the application of several coats, the surface layer becomes hard and smooth, and also shiny. It is also waterproof. Many items were coated with lacquer in China, Myanmar, Thailand, Japan, Korea. Not only containers, dishes or trays, it included furniture or even coffins. Before lacquering, the surface could be painted or inlaid with other materials like shells or mother of pearl, in which case a transparent lacquer was applied. It could be carved too. This technique was documented in bowls from 6,000 years ago, discovered in China, or ornaments from Japan that are 8,000 years old, and it only grew in refinement over the millennia. Now in Burma, the sap from a local tree, the Burmese lacquer tree, was used. It grows wild in the forests of Myanmar. This sap naturally turns black when it dries, and it is probably that kind of lacquer that was used here. This type of piled up rice bowls are typical from Myanmar, which for the most part is a rather hot and wet country for months of the year. And the lacquer here was not only aesthetical or decorative, it resisted to a degree to the effects of exposure to moisture or heat. So that's it. Please let me know if you liked that kind of video. I could make more, not many more like this because I wouldn't have enough stuff, but I could probably make another one or two with other objects. We have reached the end of this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon for another adventure. Sleep well.